Can you spare a little change? Help the homeless. Please, spare a little change. Imagine a young man sat on the pavement with his cup rattling a few coins, trying, willing, desperately to beg enough money to make sure that he can buy enough intoxicants to ensure that he slips into a deep, comatose sleep on the hard, cold floor of the derelict caravan that was the closest thing that he had to a home at the time. Imagine him for a moment tossing and turning a little from one side to the other, adjusting the thin blanket that was over him. Imagine his gums kind of pulsing and throbbing from the gum disease that had eaten its way into him from years of self-neglect and self-abuse. Imagine his horror just a few days later when he finally got to change his clothes, to discover that as he removed his t-shirt, that neatly lined up along the seams were rows of body lice. I don't need to imagine, because as you may have guessed, that young man is me. And I guess you may be wondering, so how did I get from there to where I am now? And how did I get from where I was on the street, on the floor of that caravan? So the best way to explain really is to start just very briefly at the beginning. So before I was a year old, my mother left her body. She was taken by cancer. And my father remarried not long after, and myself and my brothers and sisters were reunited. And I'd like to say that things got a bit better from there. But what happened was that my new mother, my stepmother, she struggled to cope with 4 children that weren't her own. And then her own son arrived as well. She became increasingly angry and abusive and violent. And living in my home wasn't really a home, it was a scary place to be because you never quite knew when she would erupt again. So, the result of this experience was that I grew up with low self-esteem, feeling that I wasn't worthy, that I was unlovable, and that I would never really come to anything. You see, children are a little bit like wet cement, and what befalls them creates an impression. And that was the impression that was created for me. If we fast forward a little, I was 18 years old and I was leaving my parents. And I had high hopes. I was free. I could get away from this oppression, this control, this fear, this violence. And I could start living my life. I was shuffling over into the driver's seat of the vehicle of my life for the first time. But you know, the funny thing is that sometimes if your beliefs are such, the reality that you manifest will be in alignment with those beliefs. And because I didn't feel very much self-worth, I quickly found myself sort of sliding into a shadowy world of crime and addiction and violence and eventually homelessness. But I don't really want to talk too much about my story. The little plug from me is that the book Stepping Stones in the Mist, Life Lessons for Overcoming Adversity is what charts that story. But things move and things change, and something has become really apparent for me recently. I worked for many years with young people, but I arrived at this place when I realized the young people are just the effect. What is the cause? What is the cause of all these young people that I'm working with that have mental health issues, that have addiction issues, that have all these challenges, that have this low self-esteem, that commit this antisocial behavior, that are violent, that are abusive? And I began to see that perhaps the cause of it was that just maybe we weren't living as a society in the way that we are meant to be living. That perhaps we could do better. And if society and the fabric of society changed, then perhaps the young people wouldn't be growing up with all these multiple issues. There is a saying that says it is easier to raise healthy boys than it is to fix broken men. And I believe this is true. But the other thing that became increasingly interesting for me was that I began to see that my own story was almost a perfect parallel of humanity's story. And I began to, in my reading and in my exploration, as I began to change and grow, I began reading about mystics who were saying that the outside world is just a reflection of the inside, that what we perceive with our senses is just a tiny tip of what is really going on. And I began to reflect on my own story, and I began to see the crime that I got involved with is abundant in everywhere that I see. The crime against the land, which Polly Higgins beautifully terms ecocide, which is not illegal. The crime against the way that we treat animals on farms. The crimes that we commit against young people, against children, working hour after hour after hour in far distant lands to create cheap products for us. And the violence that goes on in the world of pornography, the violence towards women and children. And the addiction, my addiction, was drugs and alcohol and anything I could get my hands on so that I could numb the pain that I was feeling. And I began to see that we are a society that is built on addiction. The addiction of working, the addiction of busyness seems to me, and I think perhaps Lawrence would agree with this, seems to be one of the most powerful challenges that we face. Because the busyness seems to reinforce denial. What Joanna Macy talks about is our inability to face the pain of the world. Because it's a little bit like the elephant in the room, and wherever I speak, whether it's a school or a Rotary Club or a women's institute or a college or a mind, body, spirit, people come up to me and they say, it's so refreshing to hear somebody talking about this stuff. And when I began speaking about it, I kept asking myself the question, how dare you, Miguel? Why should you raise this stuff? And I remember the words of the beautiful Marianne Williamson, who I know has spoken here, when she said, if all that you're saying is getting applause, then you're probably not saying the right thing. And that gave me courage and that gave me strength to begin speaking more about this stuff. Denial for me is a bit like, standing on a train track and you can hear a train coming. There's a train coming this way, but I'm going to look that way. And it seems that that's what's going on. Everywhere that I go, I don't know if I perceive things very differently from everybody else, but I see evidence to support that denial that is going on. And it doesn't seem to me the best solution to look the other way when a train is coming. But in my own story, I was in denial for a long time. But things began to erode that denial, and I began to get chinks were eating through it. And perhaps those chinks were that I found myself in increasingly violent situations and dangerous situations, as if life was trying to wake me up, to the point that I found myself one evening stood in front of my best friend, and he had a small axe in his hand and it was raised above his head. His name was Chelsea, and he was a kind of skinhead guy with a big swastika on the side of his neck. And he was threatening to do me some serious damage with this axe. And I kind of thought to myself, you know something, Miguel? Perhaps your choice of friends leaves a bit of room for improvement. And I thought to myself, how much longer are you going to be about? My friends were dying around me from drug overdoses, from car crashes, from suicides. And it was like I was being squeezed. And life was saying, whispering, calling, there's something more. So it was that fear that began to awaken me and began to cut through that denial. And I would suggest that if we were to follow Lawrence's advice and pause a little more, because that's where the magic happens, and that's where the pain happens, and that's where we have to begin to face ourselves and the reality of what is happening, then things will begin to move along a little more. To feel the pain of what is happening. So there was that kind of addiction, and there was that fear that was breaking through the denial that I felt. But there was something else as well, because it wasn't enough. I'd been lost for so long that I didn't know how to get found. Maybe our human story is similar. We seem to have got ourselves into such a muddle that we can't work it out with our heads. And I would suggest that perhaps this isn't something that we can work out with our heads. This is the work of the heart. Which brings me to what I would say is the ultimate game changer, which is love. It was love that eventually shattered my denial. And that love for me came in the form of the love of my son. My firstborn son was born under an oak tree in a meadow. I was living at the time on a sprout farm, living in a bender, which is a makeshift dwelling made out of hazel poles with a wood-burning stove and canvas tarps over the top of it. And so we called him Okie. He was born under the oak tree, under a full moon. And I so hoped and prayed that this boy would make me begin to feel like the man that I wanted to be. The drugs weren't working anymore. The pain was coming through. The numbness wasn't happening. The top was being squeezed out of the bottle. But again, it wasn't really quite to be, because by the time Okie was 2 years old, I still had this growing, nagging pain, and I began to become increasingly obnoxious and insecure and needy, and I wasn't a nice person to be around. And I woke up one morning and I thought to myself, you know something, Miguel? Perhaps your son would be better off without you in his life. Perhaps you should just walk away. But that love for my boy whispered to me and said, try one more thing. And I got in my van and I went and found a counsellor in the closest town. I went from different places. I wasn't registered with doctors or dentists. I'd been living under the radar for years. And I just went to place and said, I need help, I need a counsellor. And eventually I found one. Somebody gave me a telephone number and I rang them. And there were light bulb moments. And in that sharing, in that speaking, I began to see what it was that I'd been running from, and that it was time for me to take responsibility. And I would suggest that perhaps it is time for us to take responsibility for what is happening in the world. It's no good waiting for the politicians, for the CEOs, for the big corporations. Whenever there is big change, it is always us, the people, that facilitates and brings about that change. And for me, it is about love. Love of my son, love of the children. Mother Teresa said, the trouble with the world is that we draw the circle of the family too small. And I would agree. Just last year, in Save the Children in Italy, there were 12,000 children arrived along the migrant trail, the refugee crisis. There were 12,000 children, and half of those, all of those children were always, they're examined by Save the Children. They have a medical examination when they're found, these unaccompanied children. And over half of them were found to have sexually transmitted infections. And I ask you, and what motivates me is the love of these children, because they're not somebody else's children, they're our children. They're our children. I'm running out of time. Perhaps we're running out of time. So I'd like to leave you with just one thought. Last week, on Saturday, in fact, I left a piece of rewilded land in North Wales where I'd spent a week. Where I'd spent a week in ceremony, dancing, breathing, fasting for 3 days to try and bring about healing, to try and bring some love through. Because I realised in that time that I was there, the sweat lodges, the times that we all sat in council together, the prayers, the offerings that we made, the one key thing that I realised was that it is all about love. And I fell deeply and madly in love, perhaps for the first time, with the land. The land, the goddess, the earth, that which is our mother, which nourishes us. And I realize that until we fall in love with the land, and until we stop destroying and raping and pillaging the land, because the land is us, there is no difference. We are all interconnected. As we do to the land, we do to ourselves. And until that changes, things will not change. So it's about that love and that reconnection with the land. And then that gives us the courage and the passion, and that love just arises within us so that we can't do anything else but love and contribute and do what we can in whatever small way it might be, whether it's just little random acts of kindness. Rumi, the beautiful Sufi mystic poet, said, "Let what you do be what you love. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground." I leave with you with the question, how will you kneel? Thank you.